Michelle, welcome to the Easy Conversations show. Thank you for joining me today and taking the time to have this discussion with me. I think there's a lot of wisdom around the stuff we're going to cover today, and I've been able to get a brief understanding of the Ayurvedic world through some of the addiction work I'm doing in terms of the clinic I'm working on at. The director there has a lot of experience in this field, so I've been able to get some high level understanding, but I'm hoping to explore that further. But before we jump into it, I do want to give you an opportunity to share a little bit about yourself with the listeners, a little bit about the work you're doing and what's brought you here, just to give us some of that additional context as well.
Yeah, that sounds great. Thank you so much for having me. I'm really excited about this conversation today because, like I'm sure you are, I'm very passionate about what I do to help my clients with mainly around kind of mood, mental health, and from this trauma informed perspective. But I'm also a clinical herbalist and a functional nutrition counselor. And so I weave all of those different angles into what I do to help my clients and have found that this modern take on functional medicine and functional nutrition,
Mhm.
paired with this ancient understanding of herbal medicine from an Ayurvedic perspective, is such a beautiful interweaving of two traditions that actually make a lot of sense to put together. And so, yeah, I'm just excited to share more about how I'm using traditional medicine with some of our more current functional medicine approaches to help my clients.
Mhm. And just around that, do you see, you've briefly touched on it, but there is quite the overlap. I think for me, I don't have any expertise or a very basic understanding around the functional medicine space, but I focused on my diet and what I was putting into my body a few years ago. And that's been phenomenal in terms of the changes I've experienced. And I think on the physical level, yes, it's obvious, but I think it contributes a lot to the mental health side of things too. When I'm feeling great physically and I'm not putting toxins into my body, that's obviously affecting my mental health too. But there's, to your point, the ancient tradition that comes in. How do you see that overlap? And one of the things, as I mentioned, I was able to understand was having an awareness of what kind of foods you're eating, depending on where you fall. And I think we'll get into that a bit more as we get into some of the details. But yeah, just wanted to talk about the overlap there first.
Yeah, I'm glad you brought that up because in here in the West, in the United States, and our Western perspective on medicine has been that there really is this dichotomy between physical health and mental health and spiritual health, right? And we compartmentalize these different areas of our life, and we really don't understand that they're all connected, right? And that's what I think the beauty of whether really all traditional herbal approaches weave that in, whether it's traditional Chinese medicine or Ayurvedic medicine or many other traditions, right? There's this idea of this mind body perspective. And it's really, I think, becoming more of a thing that people are aware of now, right? That we're understanding that, oh, we are more than just a body, right? And
Hmm.
I think this is something that this new perspective of this dichotomy of mind and body is really related to our pharmaceutical approach to health, right? Where if you have depression, you go to your doctor, they give you an SSRI and they send you on your
Hmm.
way. And they don't even ask about your diet, let alone maybe stressors in your life or some of the things that could be impacting. It's right. It's just a biochemical thing that we need to shift. And unfortunately, for many people, they found that there's more to their health than just taking a medication and kind of trying to make symptoms go away, that it really is this interweaving of all these different areas of our life. And I'm glad you brought that up because even as we're having this growing understanding of the mind body perspective of healing, I still see this happening even in kind of the natural health space that some people might go to the doctor and get an SSRI. Someone else might go to a mental health counselor and have counseling therapy, which is great. But if they have different physical things happening, like you mentioned, toxins, that can definitely impact your mood. A lot of my
Mhm,
clients have nutrient deficiencies that impact our mood, things like zinc, B6. If you're deficient in these nutrients, you're not making the neurotransmitters your body needs to feel good and to
mhm,
feel happy and well and not be depressed and anxious.
mhm.
And so it's all of these pieces together that we have to interweave in order to really bring someone back to wholeness. And that's what I love about the traditional medicine perspective. It's really about wholeness and this idea of balance that I think is so
Mhm.
important, that we can bring balance back into our system and all of these levels. And that's where we're not just going to be suppressing symptoms, but we're actually going to be able to feel good in our body, be engaged with our life, feel like we can connect with people in our life, feel safe in our body, which is that nervous system response that is really underlying so much of the mental health and mood issues so many people are experiencing. So it's really
Absolutely.
a beautiful perspective, right?
Yeah, and you touched on the deficiency side of things, but there's also putting stuff in, right? And I touched on toxins, but like alcohol, sugars, empty calories that we consume in today's world, that all has an impact. And unfortunately, people don't have that awareness at times and they continue on with their lives not knowing what it is. And I've touched on this before where the Western medicine approach is very reactive. It's, oh, okay, there's a symptom here, I'll give you a medication for this. Whereas some of these ancient traditions, as you've touched on, are a bit more proactive and you're really taking your own health into your own hands and focusing on these things. But just to ground the listeners, are you able to give us a brief overview of the Ayurvedic approach and some of its historical context, in terms of where
Absolutely.
it originated, and it's just to ground the listeners a little bit.
Of course. Yeah. So Ayurvedic traditional medicine is really the traditional medicine of ancient India, right? We've had this tradition in practice for over 2,000 years and longer. And it's really parallel with traditional Chinese medicine, right? So some overlaps there, although these two ancient systems of traditional medicine started in two different places, but there's some interesting overlap in that they both are an energetic system of
Mhm.
healing, meaning that this idea of energy is such a beautiful and profound part of traditional medicine, in that it's really that idea of balance, right? I understand my unique energetic patterns, and then I can match that with the herbs or even foods or even activities that I'm doing in my life that will help bring balance back into the body. And so just a quick example I like to use just as myself. I tend to be I'm a small person. I tend to be cold all the time. I'm usually in my house with a sweater on, drinking some tea. And so that's my energetic pattern, right? I tend
Mhm.
to be cold. I tend to be like a light sleeper. So in Ayurvedic tradition, my mind body type, I'm a Vata type or Vata Pitta. And
Mhm.
talk more about mind body types if we want. I have a little quiz I can share with your readers so they can
Mhm.
find out their own mind body type. But so that's just my energetic pattern compared to maybe someone who is always warm all the time, right? That person who, no matter what room they're in, they're always sweaty and they're always in a t-shirt even in winter. And so in order to balance that energetic pattern, is that you?
Yeah.
Yeah, right. So we can be in the same room, right? We can be in the same environment, but yet we have this different energetic pattern that's showing up for each of us differently. And so what really balances me is things that are very warming and grounding, like even food that's warming. I do better with soups and maybe oatmeal for breakfast opposed to a lot of salads and really cooling foods. And the same with herbs as well. They have their own unique energetic patterns. Something like ashwagandha, which everybody knows these days, is
Mhm.
a nice herb that's warming and grounding, and so really nice for someone's who has energy like I do, that vata energy, which is composed in an Ayurvedic tradition. It's said to be composed of air and ether, which is just like space, right? And so when you think of
Mhm.
air, you think of air as being the wind is blowing, right? It's very mobile. It's very right? Wind blows in, it's cooling, right? So I have that energetic pattern. And what balances me are things that are very, again, just grounding or warming. And yet someone maybe like you who tends to be more of maybe more a pitta type, more composed of fire and water. And so that fire tends to predominate. So people with a
Hmm.
pitta pattern tend to be warm all the time. They may do really well with cooling foods or even activities, right? Like someone who's pitta maybe needs things that are more, I don't know, balancing in terms of like yoga and relaxation versus getting out and running and really warming up their system more than it needs to be, for example.
Hmm.
So it's really amazing how what I love about these different patterns is number one, they give every person is unique. And that's really a valuable thing I think to take home because again, just our Western society, we have this, especially as a woman growing up in the 90s and the early 2000s when I did, right? There's a certain like mold you're supposed to fit into,
Hmm.
right? You're supposed to be thin, you're supposed to be whatever. And yet I love how in your Ayurvedic approach, we have these different mind body types and they show up in our body, literally. More of the thin kind of frame would be a Vata type, more of a maybe a solid build or a curvier build would be more of a kapha type or even pitta. And it normalizes that we're all different and we all have our own unique energetics and the way we show up in the world. And they're all equally valuable. But then we also have this understanding of ourselves in what does my body need? What does my
Hmm.
mind and spirit and body need to be balanced and to be in this world in the way that I need to and am meant to and have that energy to show up without being overwhelmed, anxious, depressed, right? We can actually use herbs, which are my favorite approach, but even our foods, even our activities, everything we do can help bring that balance back into our life.
Hmm. Yeah, no, I appreciate that. Thank you so much. And yeah, you touched on the three types. I'm just looking at my notes here, but the Vata, Pitta, and Kapha. And one of the things, as you were touching on the energetic approach there, at least for me, what I understood, there's different times of the day where I can be in all three, or one, I don't necessarily need to be fixed, right? So I made a schedule around how to optimize that too, right? So for me, in the Vata space, you want to approach things, do repetitive things at a certain point during the day. And
Yes.
Pitta, like if you want to be very productive or a lot of the analytical work I'm trying to do, again, there's different times of the day I could do that. And then the exercise, eating, yoga, all of that falls within Kapha for me. So again, you need to know the energy aspects too for yourself so you can
Yes.
optimize your day accordingly. And again, we don't have that understanding. We just go about our day almost blind and wait for things to come up and then react. Whereas you can be a bit more productive and more structured around how you've got your day planned.
Exactly. And again, I just love how we can really understand ourselves on a deeper level with this approach, right? So many people are trying to put themselves into this cookie cutter type of approach, right? I should be getting up early and going out and jogging and eating maybe a smoothie for breakfast. But for someone like me, that doesn't work very well, right? Like I
Mhm.
tend to do better with leaning into that kind of that energetics of warming and grounding and maybe even going more slowly, right? Vata types tend to be more prone to anxiety, right? That again, I think of that wind, it's very scattered, right? It blows here and there and it's very mobile. That's the nature of wind. And I like those energetic patterns and how we use the different elements to explain them because it really gives a really neat way of just picturing how these things are showing up for us. But for someone who is a kapha type, they do need to like work on that. They tend to be they're composed of earth and water, right? When we think of earth and water coming together, right, that we get mud basically.
Mhm.
And so they can be tend to more sluggishness if they don't tune into that. They may do better with getting up earlier, taking a jog, and again, eating something light for breakfast and working with that energetic pattern that shows up for
Hmm.
them. But we all have an inborn, I guess you could say, energetic pattern. And that in Ayurveda is called your prakriti. And yet our patterns can shift, right, as well.
Hmm.
So even as a Vata type, if I go out, it's 90 some degrees out today here in Kansas where I live. If I go outside and start working in my yard and whatever, getting busy, I'm going to get really overheated probably, right? That pitta type, and it's the pitta time of day, as you were saying.
Hmm.
And so if I don't watch out, I can become unbalanced in that area if I were spending too much time outside and in a hot
Hmm.
day and start noticing I'm overheating, right? See the
Yeah.
redness, flushing of your skin. And so these patterns can shift. And when you're in a pattern of imbalance, that is your vakriti. And so you want to know your unique energetic pattern, but also you're watching for imbalance as well. So you can work with anything that's showing up that needs to be brought back into balance. So
Hmm.
it can sound a little complicated, but it's really not once you just start playing with the different things that you're working with, your diet, your activities, the herbs you're using, and just start to notice what's showing up for you, what brings balance back into your system, and maybe
Hmm.
what makes you feel imbalanced. And then just start working with those patterns. And again, this concept of balance is so important in herbal medicine, right? It's really the crux of the matter, right? It's not just ashwagandha is good for anxiety, which is true, but we also want to know what's the person that's taking ashwagandha, what's their pattern, and do they
Hmm.
need that, or maybe they need something that's a little more stimulating, right? Maybe they're a kapha type and they could use something more stimulating and energizing versus grounding and almost ashwagandha is almost, I wouldn't use the word sedating, but more of a
Hmm.
relaxing adaptogen. And for
Hmm.
someone who's already in that kind of sluggish state, they need something maybe more,
Hmm.
energizing and uh,
Yeah.
warming and those types of things.
Well, and I think it's to your point, being aware of when you also take it. So, being
Mhm.
again talking through those energetic forms and being aware of when you're taking some of these adaptogens that can have a positive effect. But going back to that piece of balance, I think if you're feeling out of balance, this is a good reminder or something you can use to look into what's going on. Why am I out of balance? How can I find that balance? And you touched on even within the three types, there's different types of foods that can help and can go against whatever type you are and put you out of balance. So I think there's a lot of information. And as you've touched on it, it's all part of understanding yourself to a deeper level. And like I said earlier, this is where you can influence a lot of your outcomes and your mental health. Whereas, again, the Western approach is I need to go see an expert and they'll give me something and try to fix me. Whereas you don't need to necessarily go down that route.
Absolutely. Yes. Such a good point. Because in my work, I always want to empower the clients I'm working with to, own their healing journey, right? I don't want them to
Hmm.
just come to me so I can tell them what to eat or not to eat or what herbs to take or not to take, but that they're understanding like why these foods, why these herbs, whatever we're working with is actually working for them versus what might not be right for them. Because I think when you have that understanding, you also have that buy in to what you're doing, right? I know we've talked a little bit about food, and sometimes food can be a hard thing to change, right? Especially in our just, again, this Western society we live in with all of the just food that we have available, all
Yeah.
of the processed foods. And the things can show up in these patterns like you mentioned earlier where we may be reaching for the wrong foods, sugar, or I think you mentioned alcohol, right? These coping mechanisms basically,
Hmm.
they show up when we are dysregulated and we're looking for something to, whether we're not doing it consciously usually, in the sense that we don't understand the reasons why we may be reaching for these foods or other coping mechanisms, but we're doing it because our nervous system is in this place of I don't feel safe in my body, right? We're
Hmm.
dysregulated. It's that place of being out of balance. And when we understand that, it's another place where we can let go of some of that judgment that we have around the things that we do, the patterns that show up for ourselves. And for myself, when I started working with the nervous system piece in my work, and the understanding of how trauma impacts the nervous system, then I
Hmm.
understood why these things show up for myself. I Part of my story was struggling with eating disorders as a teenager,
Hmm.
and then I'll just share really quickly. And then later, I was able to overcome that, became a health coach. But about 6 or so years ago, I went through a divorce. And so, really stressful time, of course, in my life.
Hmm.
And I found myself in my kitchen, like putting my kids to bed. And then I would go in my kitchen, I'd start like eating, get
Hmm.
out a jar of peanut butter and a bag of chocolate chips. And in my head, I was like, what am I doing? I
Hmm.
knew I didn't want to be doing this, but I really thought I was hungry. And it was right around this time, thankfully, I started learning about the nervous system response and how that impacts these coping mechanisms and behaviors that show up. And I was actually working with a coach on more of a mindset side of
Hmm.
things. But she invited me to start noticing what I was feeling in my body when I felt that need to eat something. And if you're listening, you can join in thinking about this or trying this. But basically, when you're hungry, you're truly hungry, I think about, I'm putting my hand on my belly because usually that's where we feel, right? Kind of that rumbling in our tummy, maybe our belly's growling. But if you think about something like anxiety, for example, and where that shows up in your body, because it is showing up somewhere in your
Hmm.
physical body. And for me and many people, it's like this pressure on your chest, right? Like I'm putting my hands here on the top of my chest and pushing in. It's really uncomfortable, right? To have,
Hmm.
thinking of someone just standing there pushing against you, right? You would be like, stop. And yet that's where we feel that sensation. Maybe anger, right? Can show up like this tightness in the back of the neck or the shoulders. As I started to just notice that, the next time I went into my kitchen and felt that need to reach for food, I just stopped for a moment and I was like, okay, what am I feeling in my body? And I was really blown away, to be honest with you, that I was not hungry at all. I was feeling this intense anxiety, right? This pressure
Hmm.
in my chest. And it sounds really simple, but it was really profound for me at that moment because when we experience trauma, anxiety, these overwhelming emotions, we disconnect often from what's really happening in our body.
Right.
And I really wasn't feeling, I was feeling something, but I was so disconnected from what I was feeling that I didn't even recognize that it was
Hmm.
anxiety. The only coping mechanism I had at that time was to reach for food. That's all I knew to
Hmm.
do to feel safe in my
Right.
body. And the first really turning point for me was when I just recognized, I started noticing. And it was really empowering to recognize, like, oh, I'm not really hungry, right? I'm just
Hmm.
anxious. I can recognize there's
Hmm.
anxiety, and then I started learning tools to work with my nervous system, herbs being one of them, of course, that I can bring my system back into a place of, okay, I'm safe, I'm supported. I don't have to feel this sense of overwhelm. And when I do, I have tools I can use to create that place of balance, right, in my body.
Yeah, no, thank you for sharing that personal experience. And I agree with you. And you touched on it too. I think we're not doing it consciously, right? So these emotions are coming up, and sometimes food is an escape, or other forms of substances can be an escape, and we just don't make the connection. And as
Exactly.
cliche as it sounds, it's feeling your feelings, right? A lot of people avoid it, or they just feel so much discomfort around it, so it's easier to try to escape. Now, the other piece I did want to explore, because of dysregulation, we were talking about it, and I just want to see if there's a, if we can tie it together. But for example, when I'm traveling, like last week I was traveling and I was visiting family, so my routine was off. I wasn't sleeping properly, and then I was eating more than I normally do, especially when I'm with family. There's a lot of food around. So when I came back, I was still doing my intermittent fasting, but I felt hungry as soon as I woke up. And normally that's not an issue. I can make my normal fast time. So it was interesting. And as you were sharing that, I started thinking about that. And I think a lot of it was because I was out of balance, because I had disrupted a lot of things that I normally focus on, which is sleep, eating properly, and eating the right amount because I can still manage, but and the type of food. Whereas I didn't have as much control on what type of food I was consuming when I was with families. Does that kind of add up when you think about the imbalance and how even the small things can start affecting us on the bodily level as well?
Oh, yeah, that totally makes sense to me, and hearing
Yeah.
that story, like, when we're out of our normal element, we're eating different foods, right? I'm even wondering as you were telling that story and noticing you were hungry when you woke up, and maybe even a little blood sugar dysregulation happening there, right? If
Hmm.
we're not sleeping well, that can impact our blood sugar. And that's a really common kind of
Hmm.
underlying biological reason for things showing up in our mood, like anxiety or depression. So it absolutely makes sense to me that as your food was shifting, your sleep was shifting, of course, your patterns in how you were eating or even
Hmm.
feeling hungry were going to shift as well.
Yeah.
But I think what's really valuable is you're able to notice that and get curious where, if we're just not even aware of the patterns that are showing up for us, then it's really hard to shift things that we don't have
Hmm.
any awareness about.
I think there's an aspect of, again, we've touched on this a few times, understanding yourself. And for me, I've put a lot of effort and emphasis on that piece and knowing what things serve me and what don't, and when I'm feeling at my best. And I was only visiting for 3 or 4 days, but in that short time frame, just not managing some of those things as well as I normally do when I'm at home, it was immediate. So it just shows, yeah, to your point, I've just been paying attention to it, whereas in the past maybe I wouldn't have and just gone along with it. The point here I'm trying to make is really having that level of awareness because that could really serve you. And to your
Yes.
point, I was also feeling it within my mood and my emotions, and maybe I need to dive a bit deeper and understand what else was coming up for me.
As you're saying that, what I'm thinking of is the other kind of area that I focus on with clients is
Hmm.
their routines. I like to talk about them as routines and rituals that we have
Hmm.
because what I started noticing with my clients, I work with a lot of women or who are dealing with anxiety or depression, maybe perimenopausal, menopausal women. And I
Hmm.
noticed this pattern with them where I have them start maybe some herbs or maybe some supplements. Maybe they need some magnesium or other nutrients. And we work on food, of course. And yet, what I was finding was they weren't really tuning into their routine. And one of the first clients I worked with that I noticed this with, she was a mom. She had some kids, probably like grade school age. And I think she was like a masseuse, right? She was a massage therapist. And so we were just, as she was struggling with her mood, she'd take her kids to school, go to work, come home, and like crash on the couch. And we were working on her energy. And of course, she was feeling depressed. And as I was questioning and we were talking, I found out that she would like drop her kids off at school. She'd go to work. She'd try to like work through as many clients as she could. So she wasn't eating lunch. She
Hmm.
was just working through that. Basically, she was trying to stay up in her like sympathetic nervous system response, right? Like her stress response to
Hmm.
get things done through the day. And then so she could get off in time to pick up her kids from school. And then by the time she got home, like she hadn't really worked with her routine, right? She didn't have any balance to her day as you were going back to the point you were talking about with the different times of day that we can be doing things and working with the
Hmm.
different patterns that show up throughout the day. And of course, she was just crashing by the time she got home. Probably, again, even on that biological level, blood sugar would be
Hmm.
crashing if you haven't eaten lunch, right? So many, all of these different things, right? They all matter, right? It's not just that we're low in magnesium or we have low neurotransmitters or we need to talk to someone about some problems in our life, right? All of these things come together and they make a difference. And so that's why actually one of kind of the core tenets of my approach with my clients is working on their balancing routines and rituals, right? I like them to
Hmm.
also bring in what I call rituals in terms of just morning rituals that will help them to maybe it's meditation or prayer or yoga or or whatever works for them, right? Somatic tools they can bring in, or
Hmm.
maybe it's a bath before bed, and just whatever relaxes them and helps them to come back into their body, because we so often just keep going. We don't even tune into what's happening in our
Right.
body and what our body needs. And so we need to work on those routines so that we're taking those times throughout our day to stop, especially
Hmm.
meals, right? We have that opportunity hopefully 3 times a day to stop, sit down. I'm thinking of another client I just worked with, and she struggling with her mood and doing all kinds of right things. Like she came to me taking all kinds of supplements, and she's done all the different programs out there for meditation and
Hmm.
tapping and all kinds of good things. But then I just asked her about, and she's on a really restricted diet. She has a lot of digestive issues. And when I asked her about how are you eating? Right? Are you sitting down? Are you relaxing? And she got this guilty look on her face and she was like, no, I just stand up, I rush. And she actually did connect it back to the fact that she noticed that she felt this, I guess she called it grief around being able to sit down and really nourish herself. So there was some work there to do. But the
Hmm.
idea of just noticing these patterns, there's this saying in Ayurvedic tradition that I shared with her that when you eat standing up, death looks over your shoulder. And I think
Mm.
it sounds really dramatic, but the saying is basically that we need to sit down, we need to
Mhm.
relax, we need to be actually in our parasympathetic response of our nervous system, which is that rest and digest part of our nervous system. Because if we're not even turning on the process
Mhm.
of digestion, we're not turning on stomach acid secretion, bile secretion, all the things that we need to be able to really digest our food well. And so I always bring
Mhm.
it back to the nervous system because
Mhm.
everything depends on being able to come back to this place of parasympathetic response, which is balance, right?
Right.
In our nervous system in order
Yeah.
to even tap into what I call that healing response.
Mhm. Yeah, and I think again, we've talked about the Western system, and unfortunately, because of how much time we spend working, like things like sleep and diet are like an inconvenience, right? It's, oh, sleep is something I can manage 4 hours, 5 hours. I don't really need the 8 hours because my work takes priority. And it's the same with how people eat food, right? There, it's just get it out of the way, rush through it so I can get back to work. And what you're sharing here is no, a lot of these things need to be intentional. And this is why I like the whole aspect of routines and rituals, because otherwise we're on autopilot. And these things allow us to be more intentional and be more present because we're not taking enough time throughout our day to do that. And I've had people who look at my routines and call me rigid, but I find it ironic because there's a lot of their own projection coming out. And because they're not taking that time to do it, it's how do you find the time? And why are you so rigid with your routines? But I've also come to realize if I don't do those things, I'm not at my best again. So it's managing
Mm.
it all, being intentional. My rituals are really important because for me, I start my day on the right track. And if I don't do those things, then I know I'm not starting my day in the best place. So it's important to have those rituals and routines. And they may seem at times like a chore, but it's how can you make it more enjoyable and get something out of it? Because when I'm more present, more intentional with it, it feels good. I feel like it's
Yeah.
a part of my purpose in life, and it allows me to ground myself and focus on the things that really matter at the end of the day, because me working 8 to 10 hours is not really going to matter in the grand scheme of things.
Yes, it's so true. We really just get disconnected sometimes from what's truly important and valuable in
Hmm.
life. And like you said, I think it does go back to just our societal structure, which we can't necessarily shift overnight, but we can bring in that awareness for ourselves and start shifting patterns. And I'm glad you mentioned it feels good when you're doing your routine. I was thinking as you were saying that, right? How yes, they can be challenging to start building in these routines, but number one, they don't have to be complicated.
Hmm.
I You have an hour in the morning to do yoga and meditate and prayer or whatever you like to do, that's great. But even if you have 5 minutes to just stop and do maybe some breath work, just to stop and ask, what am I feeling in my body? It's things like essential oils I love to use because they're so simple, right? And easy to apply, or we can put them in a diffuser. They can have a profound impact on our nervous system and our mood. Just simple things like that we can even take with us. But again, I think it's so valuable. And when we start to do those routines, they do add to our life. They're not taking anything away. And we have more capacity to then do the things we really want to be doing. So I am a big fan of working with our routines and making sure we're just bringing in some small things every day to help us
Mhm.
come back into our body, notice what we're feeling, and bring that place of balance back into our
Mhm.
life.
Yeah, for sure. And talking about the societal implications, what are your thoughts around like these ancient traditions being around for so long? There's so much globalization. Yoga's become very mainstream. But why are some things like Ayurvedic so like ancient still and so foreign for us? Why aren't they also being accepted more and knowing some of the benefits as you're a practitioner yourself, you see the benefits. Why has it taken so long for us to accept it as a society versus some of the Western medicine that we continue to spend so much time focusing on and spending millions of dollars in these industries? Uh, Maybe I'm answering the question myself, but
Yeah, it's
I want to.
definitely getting there, right? Yeah, I mean, I do think that part of it is before the advent of pharmaceutical medicines here in the West, especially in the United States, where a lot of these pharmaceutical companies are based out of, and it's big business. And
Hmm.
but before they were on the scene, even here in the US, right, herbal medicine was the medicine that doctors use to treat their patients. And so we do have this rich herbal tradition even here in the US, but it was really pushed to the side, right? When modern pharmaceuticals came
Hmm.
along, and then this whole advent of modern medicine, unfortunately, right? And so things like herbal medicine were really they were alternative medicines. They were
Hmm.
many from the Western tradition. Many Western practitioners really looked down on
Hmm.
even herbal medicine. And yet, and it's neat to see though, that didn't happen in the East like it did here in China and India. Herbal medicine is used right alongside of modern pharmaceutical approaches in the hospitals and what have you. And I think it is just the way that kind of storm of pharmaceutical medication coming on the scene really pushed a
Hmm.
herbal medicine out of the mainstream conversation around medicine. Though we're seeing an interest in that because
Hmm.
people are recognizing that these modern pharmaceuticals and they can have their place. I'm not saying they're all terrible, but yeah, we need to recognize, of course, that
Hmm.
they have their limitations too. And with a lot of the current issues that people are experiencing, they're not right. They're not bringing the answers that people are looking for. These
Right.
a lot of people are dealing with chronic health issues related to the food we're eating, toxins in our environment, our modern lifestyle that's out of balance. And so those are the answers, right? The food, the ability to remove these toxins from our body, the ability to get sleep and balance our routine are really the answer. And so I do see that traditions like Ayurveda are becoming more popular, and people are more open to these traditions. And I think it's just something like yoga. It's going to take time. And,
Hmm.
we have to, I guess I'll say, translate it into maybe a little bit of our Western way of thinking as well, right? Because it is a
Hmm.
different paradigm than many people, even the kind of the vocabulary around it, if you will, like vata, pitta, kapha. These
Hmm.
are words that just most Americans don't know what they mean. And so
Hmm.
there's a learning curve there, I think. But
Hmm.
we are seeing a lot of Ayurvedic herbs becoming really popular, right? Like I mentioned, ashwagandha. Even people who probably have never heard of Ayurveda are hearing of things like
Hmm.
ashwagandha, right? And some of the other traditional herbal Ayurvedic herbs that we have
Hmm.
available. And I think that's a great way to get in the door with Ayurvedic medicine and this Ayurvedic approach. And then most people start to see these things are working and they want to know how to make them work better because we want to bring that balance in. I would just want to mention, since we've talked about herbs
Yeah.
throughout this conversation, that in really all traditional herbal medicine traditions, the herbs were never used by themselves. We never just went
Hmm.
out and said, "Oh, you have stress, you have anxiety, take ashwagandha." But they would build these really beautiful custom formulas for their clients, their patients. And so they would bring in balance into that formula. So even though ashwagandha can be a little bit relaxing and warming for some people, we could pair it with something that's maybe a little bit more stimulating or cooling, right? We can balance that energetics of an herbal formula and really personalize it for the person using it. And that's what I think is really exciting about really knowing how to use herbs for your
Hmm.
health, because again, like we hear a lot about ashwagandha, so people are rushing out and buying
Right.
ashwagandha, which is great. But I've had clients who it didn't work well for, and
Hmm.
because it didn't work with their energetics. And so I help them to balance, right, that a little bit more for their unique system. And so that's where I'm hoping to bring in more of the conversation of how do we use these herbs to bring balance into our mind and body so we really get the benefits.
Absolutely. And I think to your point, what I'm taking out from there is you need a deeper understanding. You can't just rush to a solution that you hear that maybe worked for someone else. And then I think there's skepticism around it too. I know you mentioned you grew up in the 90s. So did I. I remember growing up and watching the Seinfeld episode where George goes to functional medicine guy and gets messed up completely. So I think there's that again, because it's foreign, because it's there's skepticism around it. Perhaps people haven't adopted it, but to your point, it is coming through, and more people are starting to see the benefits of it through just their own experience. But it may take time, and like I said, I do see benefits myself, and I don't personally go for medication myself. I think just there are other ways of managing our health. And one of the things I do want to expand on further, because we touched on it briefly, is the nervous system, because that is something that is deeply profound. I know you talked about being in the sympathetic, but also understanding how some of these things and just the awareness can affect our nervous system and our mental health for that matter. Just want to get more of your insight and perspective on this, and someone that's perhaps struggling with some mental health challenges from time to time. And I know you touched on anxiety as well, but what are some things they can really do here to get a deeper understanding?
Yes, so that's a great question because I like to say the nervous system is really like the crux of the matter here, right? If our nervous
Hmm.
system, the job of the nervous system is to help us feel safe in our body. And it's basically constantly like scanning the environment, asking, "Am I safe?" And we've developed this nervous system response throughout humanity. And
Hmm.
back when we were maybe hunter gatherer societies and our ancestors were hunting and watching out for tigers or what have you from jumping out from behind the bushes, right? They were constantly scanning their environment, making sure they were safe so they could what? Take action if they needed to, or they could say, okay, I'm safe, I can relax. And our nervous system, again, right, is regulating all of this. And so whenever we are in a state of stress, we that's our sympathetic response, right? We go into this place of fight or flight, and
Hmm.
literally everything in the body is changing, right? Like our hormones are shifting, our blood sugar, like we talked about, is shifting because we need to have energy to fight or flee. And yet in today's society we don't live necessarily watching for a tiger to jump out behind every bush, but
Yeah.
hopefully. But we live in kind of this world that's just like chronic stress, right? Like you mentioned, working like 8-10 hours a day. It's relentless, it never ends, we always have to be on, there's always stuff that needs to be done. And our nervous system starts to develop these patterns, right, where this can happen very early in life, when even in utero, like from our mother, right? If she's stressed out, we were getting those signals from her body and her hormones. And so if we grow up in a home where we didn't feel safe for whatever reason. And it may not have been necessarily that we were in a home that was abusive, but maybe we just didn't get the
Mhm.
signals that we needed from our caregivers that I'm safe here, I'm okay. We maybe had to always be on guard that, you know, I don't know, we didn't get handprints on the wall or whatever, we got yelled at.
Mhm.
And there wasn't that co-regulation we needed. And then, of course, all the stress that comes as we grow up and going through school and getting jobs and all the things we do. And so our nervous system is right, it's like scanning the environment and then it's creating these patterns around if we think we're safe or not, if the world is a safe place to be in. And I also would mention that again, there's these different pieces of the puzzle. It's not just one thing. It wasn't just the relationships maybe we had throughout life, but it's also our biology. I have clients, I screen them for different biochemical imbalances like methylation issues or pyroluria. And we can talk about those if you want, but basically, there are patterns that can show up. There's a genetic component to these that
Mhm.
basically make someone more prone to stress and overwhelm and anxiety or depression. And so, for some of my clients who just have always had this in the background, this sense of anxiety or feeling down and depressed, sometimes there is this biology piece behind it that we need to address. And again, it's bringing all of these pieces together, but it's all relating back to how our nervous system is responding to the world and then telling us if we're safe or not. So we
Right.
need to get to this place where we know how to, first of all, recognize what we're feeling in our body, this sense of safety or unsafety. And then we need to know how to bring in tools to regulate that sense of safety in the body, work on the biology. What I love about herbs is they do all of that. They can actually work on the nervous system response to help us go from this place of anxiety and worry to like bringing it down, right? To a place of, oh,
Mhm.
I am safe in my body. And nothing outside of our environment changed, right? It's just
Right.
our perception. And they also work on the biology level. We know that when we're stressed and we're overwhelmed, right? We have so much stress we can't handle, basically, we can't move forward and deal with the stress. We go into overwhelm. And we call that the dorsal vagal freeze response, if you're familiar with the polyvagal theory.
Mhm.
But basically, that freeze response is this place of overwhelm. And these are a lot of the clients I work with who they have these really chronic patterns that are showing up with whether it's chronic like depression or other chronic issues like fibromyalgia or hypothyroidism, autoimmune conditions. And basically, their body's gotten to this place of, I just can't anymore. I'm too overwhelmed to deal with these stressors. And on that biology level, that's a very low energy state. And so we know adaptogens, for example,
Mhm.
can work on the mitochondrial level to help bring energy back into the system. They can work on the HPA axis response. So we're
Mhm.
helping to regulate our stress hormones. Things our response to stress is improved. And we have nervines that work on the, again, the nervous system response and nutritive tonics, right? We can bring nutrients
Right.
into the system. Herbs help the body detox. They really just do it all. And
Mhm.
not learning another like technique, and as I'm all for things like meditation, prayer, tapping, somatic
Mhm.
practices, but what I love about herbs is we can use those along with these practices. And again, like we can bring our system, our body, our nervous system back into this place of feeling safe, supported. I'm okay to
Mhm.
be here in this space without feeling so overwhelmed while we're using those tools. So I had a client who the other day I was working with, and she said, all these tools we have, they're not the destination, but she said they're like the raft to get you there.
Yeah.
And I loved that so much. I was like, I'm going to use that because it just made so much sense to me to say, we have these tools, and as we start using them and putting them together, we all want to get to this place where we feel good, right? We feel safe in our body, but we feel like alert, we feel calm, and yet we're able to engage with life, engage with the people in our life in a healthy way. And all of these tools can help us get there. And for me, herbs is like that little motor on the motorboat to help me
Mhm.
get there faster. So that's why I love this Ayurvedic approach that really truly is holistic, right? Mind,
Mhm.
body, herbs, food, routines, it all matters.
Absolutely. Yeah. And I think one of the other areas I've come to realize and appreciate also is how these herbs can impact our gut health.
Mhm.
And for the longest time, we never really focused on that. And that has a significant impact on our mental health too. And for all the reasons you've talked about. And a lot of these things that we consume can have a huge impact, right? Depending on
Absolutely.
our fight or flight response. And if we're in a chronic stress or experiencing chronic stress, whatever we're consuming can affect that. And then it can have other impacts too. Like one of the things I've come to realize is if you're in that elevated stress state, your immune system is shutting down. So that's why you see a lot of people experience chronic illnesses and diseases from being in those stress states. So that's something we've talked about on the show as well. But as far as biology goes, I'm just curious, how does biology fit into it then, like in terms of the work you do in herbs? Because that's something, again, people could say it's just something you're born with, right?
That is true. And but I think what you just said there, that's a lot of that is biology, right? Where and that's why I say the nervous system is really the foundation here because if we don't feel safe, we're in a stress response, we're not turning on our digestion. It is shifting the way our immune system works. It's turning on inflammatory mechanisms. So all of these things that we think are chronic health issues, gut issues, hormone issues, we can draw them all back to our excuse me, our nervous system response. It's really that biology where we can shift our nervous system biology by number one, bringing in the things our nervous system, our body needs to create energy. I mentioned the freeze response and how it's a low energy state. So even at the cellular level, the mitochondrial level, there we're not producing enough energy to have an appropriate stress response, right? We can't do the fight or flight because we just don't have the energy. And again, like herbs can help us to support and improve our mitochondrial function. They can, like you said, they can work on the gut health, they can work on hormones. Like they really do all of the things for the biology side of things. Now, when I say biology, I'm just talking about all the biochemical mechanisms,
Mm-hmm.
right, that are involved in our body, making our body do what it needs to do to just live, right, to survive. And again, right, that's the goal of the nervous system, survival. And so we can bring in these modalities to help shift that biology. Now, some of these we do say there's a genetic component. Like again, I mentioned pyroluria. Basically, this is a genetic issue that our body will excrete vitamin B6 and zinc along with the pyrroles. And that's something that can be easily tested for. People with pyroluria have they tend to be my people who have lifelong issues with anxiety and overwhelm depression, and they get stressed really easy. They might be people who they're really sensitive to lights or sounds or people, right? Life is just overwhelming. And it's really interesting as well how with these different biochemical imbalances, even nutrient deficiencies and neurotransmitter deficiencies, they each show up in different ways. Like there's this different constellation of symptoms that can show up. I can actually give my clients an assessment, and based
Mm-hmm.
on how they're marking the boxes, I can know where to put our focus with testing or neurotransmitter support. And that's something else herbs can do, right? They can help us produce adequate levels of neurotransmitters like GABA, serotonin, endorphins, which play a big role, right, in our mood and how things are showing up in our emotions, our ability to feel safe and regulated in the
Mm-hmm.
body.
Yeah, no, I definitely appreciate that. Thank you so much, Michelle, for all your insight and the information you've shared with us today. I think it's crucial for us to understand it. And we touched on the Ayurvedic energies, functional states like the Vata, Pitta, or Kapha. And you said there's a quiz people can do to find out where they would fall. So just want to give you an opportunity here in terms of some stuff we may not have touched on. I know we touched on a lot, but if there's anything else you feel is relevant for the listeners to know, how they can find this quiz, or if there are other ways they can find your work and get a hold of you, what are some of those ways as well? Sorry, just throwing a lot at you here, but yeah, just wanted to
That's
give you an
okay.
opportunity.
Great. I appreciate the opportunity to share more. Yeah, I have a free quiz that I will send to you if you want
Hmm.
to share that with your audience. You can also find me on my website, botanicia.com, and you can put that in the show notes, and that way they can find that without having to know how to spell it. And but with that quiz, you can actually find out your own unique mind body type based on these Ayurvedic different different mind body types that are available. So there's vata, kapha, pitta, and you're a combination of these three. So
Hmm.
it's really kind of a fun way to find out your mind body type, but also get to know more about yourself and your body and kind of why these patterns show up for you the way that they do. So I'll share that with you.
Yeah, and I think for me, the biggest aha was just looking at what kinds of foods are not good for me, and we
Yes.
just don't have that knowledge, or we don't necessarily spend the time to understand it. So I think that's huge as well for people that do want to check that out as well.
Yeah, that's a good point, right? It's not just about what is good for us, but sometimes the things that aren't. I'm thinking of back when I was first learning about Ayurveda, I actually worked in a health food store as a health coach. And so it was like this grocery store, basically. It was cold all the time. And there was this one point where I was like taking digestive bitters, which are very cooling,
Mhm.
and eating like salads for lunch. And I'd finish my lunch and I'd just be sitting there shivering. And I finally dawned on me that, like, oh, again, I'm a vata type. I shouldn't be taking all these bitter herbs, these cooling foods. And so I stopped, just started eating more warm, grounding foods, and I noticed that pattern really shifted. So,
Mhm.
yeah, it can be really fun and interesting way to get to know more about yourself and what works for you and your body.
Yeah, absolutely. Yeah, we'll definitely put all of that in the show notes. But thank you again, Michelle. This was great. I really enjoyed our conversation today. Lots to learn. And I hope the listeners are able to take a lot out of it too and be able to make some of those changes in their lives.
Amazing. Well, thank you so much for having me.